All right, welcome back to another episode of the Aspiring VC. Your host, Matt Snow with Mass Ventures here. I have the pleasure of speaking to Jessica Lee, angel investor and venture partner. But before we talk about anything venture or business, let's talk coffee, Dunkin' or Starbucks. What is your pick, Jess?
I think honestly, Dunkin's, it was like a lot cheaper for me in high school. And then I just kind of got hooked on it and like kind of their offerings a little bit better too.
Well, I know that you spent some time on the West Coast, so I appreciate you staying loyal to the East Coast coffee roots. Um,
Exactly.
but, for people who don't know you, do you want to give a 2-minute summary, who are you and explain some of the angel investing and, venture partner roles that you've done?
Yeah, totally. So I'm Jessica. I'm currently a full-time growth marketer at Sagino. We're basically a growth stage company that's building a B2B procurement marketplace for the life sciences. So like an Amazon for lab supplies. So that's my full-time role, but then also do some content things, including with Alpha, which is this Y Combinator startup. That's a community for now a little over 45,000 women in tech. And then also scout for a few different funds in different non-overlapping spaces and stages, both consumer and enterprise, from pre-seed all the way to Series A all around the world. So open to strong teams anywhere doing anything. Also, angel invest myself since end of last year. So relatively new, but have done some exciting deals in the past couple of months, and also invest alongside amazing angels at the Council and Comma Collective and Hustle Fund. So I've gotten a chance to meet tons of really cool operator angels or full-time VCs who are also angels. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. I guess right before this, I was a full-time investor at Soma Capital, which is this seed stage fund based out in San Francisco that's pretty sector agnostic, but leading anything with a B2B sales cycle and a software focus. And so have some experience investing there too fairly recently.
Yeah, I think you're a superstar. You basically do all of these things in the venture and startup world, and you've been on both sides of the table. Um, but some people might wonder, like, how do you even become an angel investor? How do you become a venture partner? Like, how did this stuff come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first I'll answer the angel side of things. So honestly, it sounds really silly and simple, but sort of hanging a shingle out there and just sort of saying like, oh, I'm an angel investor, and telling not everybody you meet perhaps, but everybody you're comfortable sharing, or select few people to start who are investors or otherwise plugged into the startup ecosystem, the other angels who you're in touch with and whatever contacts, and just telling them in your intro, or when you're catching up with them and updating them on your life, and just say, oh yeah, also I'm starting to angel invest, and I haven't actually invested in anything yet, but I am looking. So if you see of any great companies in XYZ sector, XYZ stage, would love to be posted and meet those founders. And I think obviously not every single person you say this to will remember or even see any relevant deals, but some people will, and quite a lot, if you do this many times. And so they'll send you really relevant opportunities. I think that's kind of just one simple thing you can do, even like posting, not maybe as a formal post, but sharing on LinkedIn in your role or title that you are an angel investor, or you've been on Twitter, whatever social media platform you prefer. That's sort of another similar way to go about it, and sort of announce to the world, so to speak, in a more scalable way that you are angel investing. I think a third thing to do is basically join different angel communities. So the council, for example, that I'm a part of, that's a little bit more consumer focused, although not explicitly, and group of women angel investors. And then Comma Collective, a little bit of a different focus, since they're very strictly enterprise focused, focused more on operators who are angel investors. And so it's kind of a different lens of investing, a different sector focus, obviously. And so I think kind of getting tapped into different angel communities where you can sort of crowdsource, if you will, sourcing among all the different people who are in the community. Of course, there's some folks who are going to be more active than others, but I think it's a really great way to gather a lot of people together and not just see what you see, but also see what they all see, and be able to look at things, share ideas, share perspectives, share diligences together. And so that's on the angel front. In terms of the, actually, one more thing I'll add there is actually mentoring at different accelerators is really helpful. So pre-seed accelerators, sometimes seed ones, and most accelerators obviously really early stage, or even like idea stage, but basically getting to know founders through that, and being able to have sort of a very give first relationship with them, where obviously the first interaction you have with them is not about a transaction or a deal or trying to get allocation, but rather actually getting to know them, understanding their challenges, seeing how you can genuinely help, whether it's through advice or introductions or both. And so I think it's a really great way to meet founders and develop more of a long-term relationship. Usually they're not going to be raising right when you talk to them, since they're probably in the beginnings of their accelerator journey. But I think, it's a great way to, give first, and then you're top of mind, hopefully when they do raise their round. And so that's sort of on the angel front. On the VC front, I think kind of what ultimately what most scouts, venture partners, however you want to call them, do is sort of tap into their network to support this particular fund in sourcing. And so I think anything you can do to demonstrate that you have a very differentiated, non-overlapping, but still maybe somewhat overlapping, but not entirely overlapping, and still relevant network to this investor is really helpful. So I think kind of similar idea of having a gift first attitude, of sharing deals with them, sending them things that are interesting to them, with really compelling titles as well. So they're really excited about the opportunity and more inclined to chat with the founder. Obviously, it is a good opportunity. And then once they sort of see your value, then they will kind of bring you in more formally as a scout, or kind of bring that proposition to you. And so I think that's really helpful as well. I think also just secondly, like looking at other friends in your network who are scouts, and sort of asking them about the process. And sometimes it is a little bit more broadcasted. Like I know Grisham's is pretty public, at least for their upcoming cohorts. The first couple, they were sort of figuring things out and ironing out process. And so now it's sort of, larger, open, I think, to really anybody who wants to apply. And so some are more public, some are a little bit more behind the scenes, so to speak. And so I think it's really helpful to kind of go directly to people who have been through that process and asking them how they go about doing that and getting kind of the firsthand advice.
And how did you kind of, I guess, in this process of all the networking that you did, that kind of maybe brought these venture partner roles, maybe the role kind of was brought to you and it wasn't really broadcast as an opening, but by adding value, maybe some of these other doors got unlocked. Would you say that that was accurate?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think a lot of times, even like a fund might not be thinking about a venture scout program like at a very official scale, because managing like, not that I've done this, but I just feel like managing, 12 venture scouts can be a little bit intense, on their time, and a little bit just kind of unclear how to go about it, especially if you haven't had a venture program. And obviously, people want to make sure it's a quality experience. They don't want to just like go out there with a half-baked program. And so I think a lot of funds may be hesitant to have a full-blown program as a result. And so they might just be pulling people in on a case-by-case basis, or one-off basis. And obviously they would be doing that more in network fashion. Obviously, it's not the best in terms of democratizing access to these opportunities, but I think obviously they do have time constraints, naturally, as we all do. And so I think it is sort of perhaps a logical way to go about things, at least to get their feet wet or to start. And so I think anything you can do to kind of cultivate a strong network, really give first to a bunch of people, investors and otherwise, and develop a strong reputation amongst founders too, is really helpful, and you'll be kind of more likely to be top of mind for different opportunities.
Totally. And, it would be cool to go almost like all the way back to when you kind of came out of high school, like to how you got to where you are now, like, origin story wise.
Yeah, totally. So basically, when I graduated high school, I thought I was going to do like more traditional STEM stuff. I had done a lot of science fairs in school. And so I was really fascinated by technology, more from like a research development perspective. And then when I was in college, I realized there's a sort of gap between value creation and value extraction, so to speak, or value capture. And I think it's obviously really good to do quite a bit of both. And obviously, the way in which these things get divvied up isn't always equitable or fair or logical even. But I think what happened is that a lot of the builders, engineers, people who are very technically oriented, super talented, they end up creating a lot of the value, but the value capture sometimes isn't really optimized because there isn't someone, or there isn't enough people on the business side, so to speak, to kind of help with that go to market. And so became really fascinated with the business side of everything, and started off with startups. So worked with Morning Brew actually through a cold email to Alex Lieberman, the founder. Coincidentally, he was from the same part of New Jersey as I was. So we sort of hit it off from there and helped to launch their campus ambassador program, which was super fun. And their first couple of years of life as a company. And then also worked with another startup called Lux, which was this on-demand valet parking service that was later acquired by Volvo. So was an early team member also through a cold email in their Boston office, doing much more hands-on work, so pretty on the ground, finding scooters around the city, managing employees, building partnerships with parking lots, so really hands-on operational style work. Really enjoyed that as well, but ultimately felt like I wanted to see a few more companies. Obviously, it's not super scalable to work with one at a time, and so ended up going into public markets. I'd actually been investing on my own since high school. And so I was a little bit familiar with that general process. Obviously not like a super formal training by any means, but was comfortable with that type of risk taking with my own money. And so ended up formalizing that involvement with a family office as well as a fund associated with Harvard, and also with Northwestern Mutual, the insurance company out in the Midwest. And so really enjoyed that. I think it was a very intellectually satisfying process of triangulating between different data sources to paint the picture of an industry and its future. And I really enjoyed that kind of process of intellectual discovery and learning, but ultimately felt like it was a little bit too far removed from the company. Obviously, most public markets investors can never get in touch with the company, may not make a difference there. And so really wanted to be a little closer to the action and add some more value to the company. And so partially that inspiration, as well as some herd mentality from campus at Harvard, ended up going into banking at Morgan Stanley, and was in their tech group out in the Bay Area. Really great team, really great experience, really, really active summer, but ultimately felt like it was a little bit, too, as an industry, not really the firm, just the industry was a little bit too transaction oriented, a little bit too deal oriented, and not enough long-term incentive alignment. And also felt like, obviously there's these massive deal teams, as there should be, doing these very important transactions. But, me as like a pretty junior person, the team wasn't really going to, transform this particular CEO's life. I mean, they're already like pretty far along by definition. And so it felt like then early stage venture was sort of a way to marry all the things that I really liked. So I liked the hands-on work of startups. I liked the intellectual process of public markets, and I liked sort of the breadth mixed with hands-on experience and impact at banking. And so felt like early stage venture was sort of a way to capture all of the upsides, all of the positive things about those endeavors, but not so much the negatives. And so I ended up working with a few different funds, including General Catalyst, Global Founders Capital, Romulus Capital, and Female Founders Fund, all in kind of slightly different ways, but obviously the similar theme of investing, and really enjoyed it. And I'm a pretty like risk averse person, at least thus far. And so it was really great to kind of see a whole new type of person and really interact with them and be able to add tangible value. I think also going to school in the research driven ecosystem of Harvard and of Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts, I was really drawn towards research driven innovation. Obviously, I am not a scientist myself. I guess even going back to high school where I was super excited about research, I really missed that. Obviously wasn't able to kind of keep up with it, and it no longer became my comparative advantage throughout college, and certainly no longer. And so really missed it. And sometimes maybe, I don't know, wouldn't say regrets, but definitely do wonder what would have happened otherwise. And so was really drawn to it, I think, and really felt like there wasn't and still isn't enough of a bridge between the research of an innovation world and the commercial world. And so wanted to be a part of creating that. I mean, obviously all startups are really great, but I think the research driven startups are actually able to, literally save lives, not just, time, but, actually lives. And so really wanted to be closer to those and actually create a meaningful impact on them. Obviously not in the scientific realm. That's, their whole comparative advantage, but more so in, helping them get access to capital or useful partnerships or introductions or kind of business side advice, kind of to capture the value they're creating, going back to my initial inspiration at the start of college, end of high school. And so basically ended up going full-time into venture, joined this fund called Soma Capital as their first full-time hire. So that was a really good experience to obviously be in VC, but also be an operator in many ways and kind of build out different things for them, portfolio operations, content, community, et cetera. And then ended up leaving around 7-8 months ago at the end of the summer last year and joining this company Zagina, which is sort of serving that similar mission around research-driven innovation, but obviously from a very different perspective. So we are basically, as mentioned, a procurement marketplace for the life scientists, so kind of helping scientists save time around ordering, and that whole process, which is very crucial to their experimentation, but obviously not, the best use of their time. And so basically helping them manage all of that through our marketplace and suite of supporting tools. So that's a little bit about my journey.
Yeah, no, I think you've got an awesome story. And I know
Yeah.
a couple of months ago you had a piece published in TechCrunch Extra about how and when to build marketing teams at deep tech companies. And this is front of mind for Mass Ventures because we're fully investing in deep tech and we see kind of the struggle with sales and go to market and marketing. And do you want to maybe summarize to folks about what you wrote about in that article and how you continue to think about that kind of intersection?
Yeah, totally. So basically, there it was focused on deep tech companies, including biotech. Obviously, it's a pretty broad term, and also companies that are post revenue. Obviously, in the deep tech world, as folks who are in that space know, it sort of changes when you are post revenue, and obviously, some deep tech companies are able to generate revenue early on. Some maybe never, even up until an acquisition. So it really depends. Obviously, there's less of a need for like sales when you're not actually selling anything. So kind of narrowing it down to a portion of those companies, still a meaningful portion that's a little bit more relevant. So I think a couple different things to note, obviously, a lot still covered in the article and not here, but a couple different things to note. I think one thing is like, even relying on investors, I guess, in your world, to kind of do some more of the financial stuff. I know a lot of investors serve as outsourced CFOs for different companies. And I think even when connecting with investors, seeing if that's something that they offer before kind of finding somebody more full-time or more permanent. I think a second thing too is like not being afraid to kind of try before you buy, so to speak, like contracting with somebody or with like a third party agency and even hiring from them if it all works out well, especially in a role like sales or marketing where it's very results oriented and you do want to see if people are not just talking up a big game or having a flashy resume, but if they can actually produce the results, and not even results in general, but for your company specifically that might have pretty unique sales cycles or sales situations. And so I think that's sort of a second thing to note. A third thing is actually like you can really tap into people from kind of anywhere. It's not just people who've done marketing. For example, product manager obviously is a really hot and popular role in the tech world. They actually do a similar sort of thing where they're obviously, different KPIs, all of that, but they do have KPIs and they're very cross-functional. They're very quantitative as well as qualitative. They're very creative. They're very kind of problem solving, iterating, failing fast. And so I think basically, even being a little bit more open-minded about who is a growth marketer. Obviously, you should certainly search for people who have direct experience, but don't be afraid to also engage in conversations with people who maybe don't have directly relevant experience, but at the underlying core, they may have relevant experience. And sort of similarly, if you're in a pretty regulated space, like maybe looking at somebody who's worked in fintech. Obviously, fintech is very different from biotech or whatever deep tech space, but they have managed to navigate to regulatory challenges, and so that could be in non-obvious overlapping experience. So I think that's sort of a third thing. A fourth thing I mentioned is like sometimes people are always like, oh, should I prioritize for experience in like the domain, or should I prioritize for experience in marketing? And obviously it is a pretty case by case question, and of course don't do anything you're not comfortable doing or what your gut tells you not to do. But I think and obviously again, it would be ideal if somebody had both, but in the case where you don't have both, especially because some of these spaces are a little bit specific, it's not just like anybody with any deep tech experience. It's sort of in your particular space that's relevant. And so I think if you are kind of juggling those two priorities, I would prioritize domain related expertise and have that person who's onboarded lead on the rest of your team, who obviously I'm assuming has relevant deep tech experience to kind of be able to guide them in ramping up and getting up to speed on all of that domain specific knowledge.
Totally. And, when you think about all of these kind of angel syndicates and kind of early stage funds that, you're scouting and advising for and serving as venture partners for, how do you think about, in a lot of ways, building a small fund or building an angel syndicate is kind of a layer of abstraction, but similar to building a company. How do you think about that side of the world? And I know that you are plugged into people that are building new funds a lot.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. I think it's a really great way to think about it, and obviously, as I'm sure many people will have noticed, there's like tons of new funds out there, which is really exciting. So I think a couple different things. I think one is like similar to when you're building a company, like every investor will ask a startup, if it's not already clear, like, how are you differentiated? What is new? What do you see as missing? What is the white space in this particular ecosystem you're building in? And I think the LPs will probably ask the same questions of these investors, since obviously there's no lack of venture funds out there at this point in time. And so I think being able to have a really clear why, not just around your why, obviously that's really helpful as well, but I think having a really clear why about what white space you fill, what kind of untapped part of the VC world that is seemingly a little saturated, but maybe not actually, that you're tapping into. So I think that's sort of one thing. I think a second thing is like the importance of relationships. I think as just a regular engineer or operator, obviously relationships are always important, but I think they're much less so, because you can just sort of be heads down working on your things. Similarly, the average investor at a larger fund, or a fund that's already established and out there and going, of course networking is probably more important than it is for operators, but still you're able to be a little bit more heads down, kind of rely on the broader brand of the fund to kind of carry different inbound leads, whether it's other investors for networking or founders for deal flow. And so I think as a GP or a founder of a fund, you do have to be that network yourself, and kind of think really intentionally about how to cultivate relationships, not under the brand of, this broader fund, like, oh, I work at Sequoia or something. And, that'll obviously carry a bunch of introductions for me. But, the brand is yourself. And so I think kind of how to build your own brand, not just as an individual, but for this broader organization, is really important for developing relationships for your fund, which obviously really make or break a fund in the VC world. And so I think that's sort of a second thing. I think a third thing as well is kind of thinking about it in like a 10-year time horizon. Like in any other job, like, as an investor, yes, your investments do have, 10-year time horizons, but you're not obviously forced to stay at a fund that you didn't found, for 10 years. And you can honestly leave like really whenever. Same with, operators of different companies. Obviously they would love to see it through, but, people move jobs all the time, as we know. And so I think with the fund founder, you really are on that kind of 10-year time horizon, sort of similar to a startup's journey, probably, even more, even longer, since you probably have multiple funds, but, similar to a startup journey, you're, in it for a decade as a builder. And so I think sort of having that very long-term alignment and long-term view is really important. And I think the final thing I'll say is like the importance of sales. So obviously, sales is important, not just like literally sales, but that sales skill set is really important just as a person in life. Obviously, even just in your personal life, at any job, you'd have to persuade people about different things. But I think especially for founders who obviously they'll eventually hire like a salesperson, a sales team, a sales force, but to start, they're usually doing founder-led sales, which I think makes sense, and they should. And similarly, these fund founders are pitching LPs, which, as I guess we both know, is much harder than one would expect. And so I think it is sort of this process where, as a VC, typically, you might be sort of trying to get allocation in a hot deal, and you're selling yourself a little bit there, but it isn't like a sort of more existential battle. You're still going to exist as an investor, even if you don't get that particular allocation, whereas like obviously you don't raise your funds, that's very not good. And so I think it's very important to kind of learn about sales, be really intentional about sales, and kind of hone that skill set as both a founder as well as a fund founder.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you put it great where, the investor kind of has the investor that has, the luxury of being at a fund has this, diversification and this ability to kind of ride things out a little bit more. But when you commit to either launching your own fund or launching this company, you suddenly have locked in this long time horizon, especially if you are the founder, and a different level of time and responsibility. I guess you have the luxury right now of having a lot of friends that are doing this both on both sides with the new funds and with the companies. How do you think about like knowing, you know, if they're making the right choice on when they know, like, how do they know that that is the time to lock in this 10-year horizon commitment?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think people have sort of asked me like a similar question where like they're like, oh, why don't you? So obviously I'm pretty close to, founders of both types, fund founders and startup founders. And obviously, working closely with both of those types of people. But I think people always naturally ask, understandably, like, oh, why don't you go find a company? Or like, is that your next step? Or, and I think that's a good question. I obviously don't know fully just yet. But I think for me, at least my philosophy, and I think this is the philosophy of many people, or maybe it should be, I don't know. But I think my philosophy is like, it has to be something that like I can't not do. I guess just not what I would say about a job. I mean, I love my job, but I think in jobs in general, it's sort of like default is to go and work since you need money. And so I think that's a very different, philosophy. It's like, I need a job. That's why I'm, working at a job. That's what probably most people in the US and the world would say. And so I think it's sort of default yes for most opportunities. That includes school, et cetera. And, obviously the privileged class of people. But I think with the founder journey, it's definitely default no. And it's sort of like, this idea that's nagging you, not just like nagging you as in like, oh, this is like kind of cool, I'm just gonna mull it over like every couple days or something, but like literally I can't sleep, like I don't even want to like work another day at whatever else it is I'm doing. I just want to do this thing. And so I think that's just a kind of one really important thing to feel like. Obviously, I have interests, sometimes I'll read an article and like keep thinking about it for like a couple days, couple weeks, even go back to it, every so often, but it's never been like, I can't fall asleep. I usually like sleep just fine and like go on with the rest of my life like just fine. And so I think haven't really found that yet. I think the second thing too is like even just the type of person, like even if you find an idea that you're super passionate about, because all of us can, find that, but I think you have to understand yourself and whether you do have that risk tolerance. Obviously, it has to do with your personal financial situation and where you are in life, if you have children, if you're expecting, if you're married, whatever it is, other family stuff. But I think you have to know yourself both like logistically in terms of where you literally are in life as well as where you mentally are in life. And some people I think are just like they cannot work for anybody else. That's just like their personality and their style. And that's really cool. That's definitely not me. I've, had some very good experiences working with other people all the time. And so I've never had an experience working solely for myself. And so sort of on the other end of the spectrum here. But I think a lot of people do feel like, they obviously, probably would be fine to work with, but they just like don't really like working for other people. That's just like not how they work. And so I think if that is sort of your style, and obviously if your whole life situation is sort of, able to empower you to make a jump like this, I think that's really helpful as well. So I think kind of a mixture of those two things. The final thing I'll say is like having a clear why now, because I think sometimes people will drop everything and do something, but like maybe they could have waited a couple years and like been in a more secure financial situation, or maybe it wasn't like a really good time for them life wise. They were getting married, like I don't know, making things up, but stuff like that that's more transitional and obviously demanding a lot of your attention outside of work and professional stuff. And so I think sort of like, is this the best time, again, for you personally, but also for like the industry, like why now for this particular fund or for this particular company? And obviously your LPs, your investors will ask you that. So it's good to have a good answer to that anyways. And obviously it's very core to building your company or your fund at the right time, but also really core to you kind of knowing that you made not only the right decision, but the right timing around your decision.
Yeah, I really like that insight that, if you don't have this inability to go to bed and stop thinking 24/7 about the idea, then maybe you shouldn't be making the jump given how much you're going to be committing in personal, life sacrifices and the general, agony that comes out of the struggle of being a
Yeah.
founder, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I think also even just like checking in with yourself, like for example, like everybody has like, I always like just am so amazed by like how different people are. I mean, we're all humans, but we're just really different in terms of our preferences. Like I think about like for example, like I love running, like I can just run for hours. And it's just like my favorite thing in the world to do. And a lot of people, I think would be like, oh my gosh, like I hate running. It's like so painful. Like them even thinking about running, if they know they had to go on a run, like, because I'm forcing them, or like, it's gym class or, whatever, back in high school, middle school, like they're like literally like crying and like want to throw up and like it ruins their whole day. And when I tell them that, hypothetically, if I tell them that I love running, like they're like, oh my gosh, I like cannot imagine why you feel that way, but cool, I guess. And that's sort of like how risk averse people feel about founders, or like, like obviously really cool that you're doing this and following your dreams, but like I just could never imagine like being on the line for like an entire company of people. I could never imagine like, foregoing a salary for like so many years to build something. This is, me speaking as the risk averse people, which maybe includes myself. But the founders, like when they think of that, they don't feel that way. They don't feel like scared or, anxious or like confused. They're like, wow, this is like really exciting. Like I love this. And obviously I can't explain their exact like rationale. And of course it's very different for every founder. But I think even like gut checking yourself, like you probably shouldn't go force yourself to be a triathlon person if like the thought of running makes you sick. And similarly, if the thought of, all the challenges that founders go through kind of make you feel like not so easy, not even just like obviously you're not gonna be like ecstatic about it, and even founders probably aren't, but I think if it's like really high levels of unsettlement, like just not being settled, that's sort of something to kind of give you pause as well. But I think if it sort of energizes you in sort of a good way, then that's sort of an indication that you should take that leap, or at least consider it.
Totally. I mean, I will say on the running note, I hate running. I love sprinting, but after the first 60 seconds, I'm not enjoying it. So it's cool that you have that skill. I definitely don't, but I do have high risk tolerance. So maybe
Yes, we're
some
kind
of
of
that
flipped
is,
here.
some of that's kind of founder,
Yeah.
founder like. But part of the reason the podcast was built is to help people demystify the world of venture. Obviously, way more content now than there used to be, but still kind of a confusing, opaque world. It takes a while to understand. But there's a ton of people that want to intern and work in this space full time, want to become angel investors. They want to basically kind of they want to be in your shoes. They want to get to where you are. And, when you look back at the moves that you made, the networking and, the hustling, what would you advise to these people that want to, get into this industry?
Yeah, I think a couple different things. I think about venture in particular, like I think school or like early career things really train you that there is like one path, like, here's what you should do to get into college or to graduate college well, or, to get a job or something. And there's very like a prescriptive mentality, I would say. And I think that is true for a lot of jobs. Like, how do you become an engineer? I haven't been one, but I, do think that's a little straightforward, learn to code and learn to code well. And here's a book and know these exercises. I think product managers might even be a little similar to that. Certainly banking and consulting process I went through, it is pretty straightforward. And the reason for that is like, there is like a very, at least for banking consulting that I can speak to, like there's a very fast feedback cycle where like you make a deck, that's your job. And, it's shared with the client within hours because it's very urgent. And so you get the feedback immediately from the client or your boss before the client. And that's that. But with venture, it's sort of the opposite where obviously you might be making some decks as well, but what matters is the returns of the fund. And so that doesn't really appear in the early stage until 7 to 10 years. And so it's a very long feedback cycle. And so it's sort of the opposite of banking and consulting, where in banking and consulting, if someone was asking me, how do I do that? I would say like, here's literally 10 steps, like don't stray from that path. But with venture, I think it's the exact opposite for that kind of very different, feedback loop reason, where basically it's very much about finding your own superpower, your own strength. Like there's some investors who are like super introverted. They don't really talk to anyone, but they're really great investors because they spend a lot of time thinking deeply about spaces. There's other people, investors who are really extroverted. They, spend all their time networking, and like they're also great investors. Some people are former, PhDs, and like they are able to do a lot of deep tech or research driven innovation. Some people are, former politicians, and they really understand government, and they're able to help companies in regulated spaces or that have to work with the public sector. And so I think it's all about kind of finding your superpower. Obviously, it's a little early, when you're just new grad to kind of figure that out. But I think, anything you can do to find that, identify that, and double down on that, can kind of build your brand and build your skill set around that, is really helpful to be able to, be the go-to person for companies, for investors, for deals, for operators thinking of starting companies. And so I think that's sort of one main thing that I advise. I think a second thing too is like basically just have a really give first attitude with anybody that you meet. I think people always have this mentality like when they're in school or they're early in their career that they can't really do anything for anybody. And obviously, I'm sure like the CEO of a big company can probably do more for you than you can do for, him or her. But I think, it's more like the thought that counts. I think people don't really keep track of like, oh, Jessica did me 5 favors and Matt did me 6. So, I'm going to like be more friendly with him. But I think it's much more like, oh, like Jessica, like, I'm not going to go and like check the, help metrics. Not that anybody even keeps that. But like, what is my feeling when I think of her? Like, oh, I remember when she first talked to me, like she asked me how she could help and she actually did help, or like she checks in and sees how she can help. And like, she's never really asking me for too much, but she's like asking me what she can do for, me. And so I think it's more about the feeling. And like, even if none of the intros you make, obviously, hopefully they're still pretty good, but, none of the intros you make like change their life. Like it's more about, whether or not you sort of thought about them first before kind of asking for something. And so I think kind of having a give first attitude is really helpful to kind of relationship building in a very long-term sense, not to get a job tomorrow, but, to kind of build a really meaningful friend and relationship for 10, 20, whatever years. That's sort of the second thing I'd say. And the third thing too is like, honestly, most adventure I feel like is like hard work. There's no like really big like, oh, you need to like be a coding genius or like something like that. It's very much just like knocking down doors to get into deals, like taking the time to learn about spaces, to meet with a bunch of people. There's no kind of big shortcut. I think there's no like one insight that would yield like compounding benefits, because I think venture in the early stage, for as in in your career early stage, it is very linear in terms of it's very much KPIs that are centered around time-based input. So like, how many founders are you talking to? How many founders are you getting in front of? And so I think as a result, it's very like work ethic tied. And so I think kind of like not looking for shortcuts unless there is one, and also just kind of having a really good like hustle oriented mentality is really helpful. So I think those are like kind of the 3 things that I would advise.
Yeah, and it's funny, to kind of go full circle here. I mean, we first spoke in what, 2018?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I reached out to you or you reached out to me, but I think it started out with a cold outreach on LinkedIn. We had a call. I think you did do some favors for me after the first call. I think you introduced me to some people, and we kept in touch. And here we are, like almost a full three
Yeah,
years later.
exactly. No, it's definitely a really good testament to that. And obviously, you've been super helpful, for many other people that I met, for myself, and, really, really great about sharing deals. I think kind of like one attribute or one thing that you do that's really great is kind of like sending things when people don't ask you in like a good way, where like, obviously, if I'm like, hey, Mac, can you send me this deal? Then you send it to me, like, that's great. I just means you're like responsible, which is good. But I think when you send things to people when they don't ask, and it is relevant for them, it's sort of like, oh, I've been thinking about you in a, not creepy, but constructive way. And like, you're top of mind for me. You're an important person in my network. And I want to add value for you, even when you don't ask or when it's not absolutely necessary. And so I think that's a really good thing to do that, obviously you do really well.
Well, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that a lot. And I think that very early on when I realized that, personally, when I wanted to break in, it's like that's just it's like how do you get into this world? You just start talking to people here and try to do favors for them, and then one day, one of your attempted favors clicks and actually works for someone.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I feel like we have a fairly good sense of this from what we talked about earlier, but I think I understand what pulled you into the venture and startup world, but it seems pretty clear to me. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe this seems like you'll be in this world forever. So, what keeps you, enthusiastic, interested, excited about startups and venture capital and that investing world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, a couple different things. One is like, for me, I think learning is kind of my currency. Where like I was talking to actually somebody the other day, and they were like, "Oh, how do you do so many calls? Like, don't you get exhausted? Obviously, it can be like a little tiring, like during the day, but." I think actually it's not about like having a perfect call, like, oh, that call was like, I knocked it out of the park, like it was the best, call ever. I mean, these aren't job interviews, obviously. And so you don't really need to knock it out of the park. And so I think it's very much more like, even if there was like an awkward pause here or there, like this person's not going to be my best friend forever, or, like maybe I never will talk to them again. But I did learn something, whether it's about them or their firm or how they see the world. And hopefully they were able to learn something from me. And so I think so much of, really good conversations, even if they aren't like the ultimate best by all standards, is just like learning things. And so I think kind of like making your KPIs about learning, especially in a world like venture, where obviously the feedback cycles are pretty long and they can be pretty opaque. And so I think just like, I don't know how these investments will do 10 years from now. That's very long, but I am learning. And so I think kind of like having learning as currency is really helpful. I think a second thing too is like, actually, like I really So I'm a deeply introverted person, which is like kind of surprising to people. But basically, like I sort of like to check in with myself and like make sure that I'm doing things that are like, not like ultra outside of my comfort zone, but like a little bit, or like meaningfully so. And so I think kind of like venture being a very interaction based industry is like very different from like what I would do by default if this role didn't exist. And so I think it's sort of something that really pushes me to do things that are pretty different from like my usual course of action. So I'm constantly learning about that. And so I think that's sort of a second thing that I really like about it. And I think the third thing too is like being a venture, sort of like being able to kind of see the future. And I think there's like nothing, even like at work, like I feel like my favorite moments are like when even like a super small thing, like, oh, somebody's like, you could actually phrase that email a little bit differently. I'm like, oh, that's like super smart. Like I wouldn't have thought of that. But I think with venture, it's like a whole different scale where it's not just like, email phrasing or something. That's very important too. But I think, venture, obviously you're hearing from these companies who are like rethinking like a whole category. I'm like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. Like, I don't know why anybody didn't do it, yet. And obviously there's other players, et cetera, but not too many. And so I think it's just really interesting to kind of be able to see the future and kind of be a part of that. And so I think that's really fun as well.
Totally. And it's funny. I don't know if I'd call myself an introvert, but I'm definitely an ambivert. Like I can kind of
Yeah.
be on both sides. And it's funny because I feel like you do have to constantly be taking these random interactions with new people in order to win. And every one out of 100 or 50, you like really embarrass yourself saying something
Yeah.
dumb, or just it's a weird combo, or
Yeah.
you like mess up the calendar event or whatever. And it's like,
Yeah.
you just have to, like, I was like, oh, once I break an adventure, like I won't have to be as awkward anymore. It's like, no, you still have these awkward things happen.
Exactly.
You have to keep the numbers up if you want to
Yeah.
find the new things.
Exactly.
Um, you know, I think this one is interesting. Like, what's the impact that you want to have? And I guess like twofold is like, what do you want to see founders building and maybe founders that you want to back, but also like, what do you want the direct impact of your work to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in terms of founders building, I think honestly, like I was looking at the YC batch most recent, like from earlier this week, which was like so many companies. But I think the ones that really stood out to me, obviously I haven't, had as close of a look as I would have, where I still at Soma. But I think, a couple of things stood out to me. I think one was just like a lot of these more climate oriented investments or companies. And I think a lot of investors were kind of shying away from them because they were like really capital intensive. And I have no doubt that they will be more capital intensive than like, a traditional software company. But I think, founders who are not afraid of that and like really open to jumping into hardware or just like otherwise capital intensive things or things with longer sales cycles but that can really create impact. I think kind of prioritizing for impact versus like an easier series A or like an easier seed round or like a quick acquisition or something. I think that's kind of like the general mentality that is really appealing to me. And I think in terms of my own work in particular, sort of like tied to that of like being able to support these founders and like kind of obviously their advantage is probably more on like the technical side. So obviously not touching or messing with that, but more so like helping them in sort of thinking through their commercialization strategy, thinking through their hiring strategy, thinking through their fundraising process and financial process. And so I think kind of being able to support founders like that who are, obviously all founders are amazing and really daring and really non-risk averse. But I think these in particular are like the subset of those that are very non-risk averse, not just for the sake of, being daring, but, for the sake of impact and really changing the world in a meaningful way, not in an incremental way. And so I think that's sort of like one thing. I think the second thing is sort of like, creating more diversity in the startup ecosystem for all kinds of people, all, diversity in every sense, socioeconomic, geography, gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera. So kind of being able to, help elevate more people from different backgrounds.
Totally, yeah, and we've written some thought leadership on that here at Mass Ventures, and a lot of the people I've talked to recently on the podcast have kind of mentioned that as well. And I think I don't know, I think it is super important. I think again always about this thought of like if you do invest in either an upper underrepresented geography and then and or also underrepresented founders themselves, if they have meaningful exits or if they have funds that have meaningful returns, that's kind of generational wealth that can come down that could be invested in more people in those communities. And
Yeah,
so this compounding like positive
yeah,
impact could be really awesome.
exactly.
if you're ready, we can shift into some of these rapid fire questions.
Sounds perfect.
So first one, who's been one of your most important mentors? And then, if you remember something they said or did that still kind of stands in your mind today.
Yeah, so one of my most important mentors is actually my boss from freshman year. Like he's still one of my really good friends. I just go to him with like every like stupid life question I have more like on the professional side, but he's like always super supportive. So I think one thing he said to me is basically like, so I was sort of having like a tougher period in my sophomore year of college, and I had met up with him like around Thanksgiving time when I came back from school. And he said like, everybody will mean revert. So it's less about like what types of circumstances you're in at the moment, because that could be super awesome or super bad. But it's much more about like who you are as a person. So don't kind of value yourself based on what's happening around you. Obviously, take feedback, etc., and like don't just be like wholly inward. But I think just like know yourself, know your strengths, and do the best that you can, and know that like external events aren't always and are actually rarely ever like a pure reflection of your work. And in the long run, even if it's 10 years, 5 years, like everybody will sort of mean revert to where their capabilities take them. And so that was really memorable.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, Outside of, the funds that you work directly with, who is either another venture firm or like a specific partner at one of these funds that you really admire?
Yeah, so Cindy at Capital X, she's been like super amazing, I think, just like in terms of how she uses her platform and how she uses her voice and like how daring she is and like how innovative she is in terms of exploring new fund structures and taking early bets on really awesome companies. And she's been a really good kind of close friend and like a person I look up to a lot as well. And she's really great at like elevating other people. She's done that for me a ton in sort of the VC world and helped to introduce me to tons of really awesome people and help me build my own brand. And so, really love, everything she does and like everything she stands for.
That's awesome. And then when you're looking at companies to potentially invest in, on your own or through one of these funds, what are the characteristics about a startup that get you really excited about potentially investing?
Yeah, I think one thing that people don't talk that much about is like how quickly the founders iterate. So not just like what their deck or traction looked like on, March 26th, 2021. At this time, I'm looking at them. Obviously, they have graphs showing things over time, but I think it's less about those graphs. Obviously, those are important too, but I think it's more like what experiment did they design to kind of test for different hypotheses they had, or like when they faced a low period of growth or like a challenge where they couldn't raise or like couldn't hire someone or whatnot, what did they do in response? And not just like what did they do like based on this really flashy article that was written about them, but like what did they actually do? And so I think like getting to know them really well, and not just know them like really well over this intense like diligence process, but like over a longer period of time is really helpful. And so that's sort of the number one thing. And then I think beyond that, just kind of like a really large market where like even if they pivot, they can pivot into like still a pretty big space. And then I think after that is sort of a problem that is felt by a lot of people. And I think it's sort of like there's like a way for them that not just like a big problem, but I think there's like a wedge for them. Because I think even if they're solving a big problem, like companies probably won't take a big, this is sort of B2B, companies probably won't take a big risk, like, engaging with the startups. I think it has to be like a very thoughtful wedge into like, we'll solve this small problem for you for this small price, or relatively small price in this low risk environment. And that'll build trust. And so then we have this sort of roadmap. So I think an intentional kind of roadmap that really understands not just like the problem, but the people dynamics and how companies work, like how people think in the context of a company, how stakeholders work, so kind of that kind of like understanding of people and psychology in the context of organizations is really helpful.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this recently about how much, um, like you had this article on explaining people how to do marketing and commercialize these advanced technologies. And it's like a lot of what you need to progress, either to get something to become an investment or to like lock down a sales deal, is dealing with people.
Yeah.
And people are not efficient. We are
Yeah.
not efficient, and they're
Yeah.
quirky. Everyone's weird and has their own. Yeah, and it's just like, I don't know, having this understanding is really key of, you think you know what it's going to take to get something done, and until you're dealing with like the actual people on the other end of the line.
Yeah.
It's like, all these companies are just kind of abstract. I think Yuval Naval Harari writes about this in Sapiens. Like the corporation was this kind of, and the nation state were these abstractions we made so that we could actually get humans to work on these massive
Yeah,
scales. But at the end of the day, you're just dealing with groups of people.
exactly. I totally agree.
Um, so, you know, another thing I like to ask people, you know, it's a highly like educational space, and you always have to be learning. Like, what are you following? What are your like blogs and podcasts that you go to, and maybe I don't know some of the books that were more influential on the way you think?
Yeah. So in terms of podcasts, I'm a very audio learner for whatever reason. And so I just like play podcasts the moment I like start waking up, like brushing my teeth all the way until like, obviously like not during calls or, when I'm doing like actual work, but all those kind of downtimes, even like going to the, grocery store or like, cooking or, showering, et cetera. And so that's been really helpful. But a couple ones that I really like, one is Acquired. So I really like that one. They like do a lot of really good deep dives into companies. Another one is Indie Hackers. So this is like a not really like venture scale businesses by definition, indie hackers, but it's like really, really thoughtful. Like Cortland Allen asks really amazing questions. So that's another really, really great one I like. Another one by NPR is Hidden Brain. So I love kind of like all things psychology, and I've learned a lot from that as well. And then also, obviously, Patrick O'Shaughnessy does a really good job with now has like many podcasts going on. Is like launching a new one around like I think like or like kind of intros to different spaces. The most recent one is like NFTs, but basically he has like an invest like the best for like more investor type content, but he features other people as well, and then also a founder's field guide for more like founder type content, obviously. And so that's on the investing side. In terms of newsletters, I like Not Boring a lot, like Patrick McCormick, like he does a lot of deep dives into like really interesting companies. It's like really thoughtful about that. I also like learning about retail, even though I don't do too much there, but Ritalis is a really good one in that space. And then I think also like some more industry focused ones. So reading some of the biotech stuff from Andreessen that does really good content on that front. And then in terms of books, so a couple different ones. One is actually called Brotopia. So it's this book that's like about sort of like, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of men in Silicon Valley and in tech, but it really goes into like why. And it's like so interesting, like these little events in history that happened that nobody really thought much of at the time, like making a pivotal difference. And so that was super interesting. Another one is this one on AI by I think the one at like Lee Kai-Fu or something, who is like, well, he used to be part of like Microsoft and Google, China, obviously before like those companies got a little kicked out by the Chinese government. But he has a really interesting perspective around like, the sort of hidden strengths that China has in sort of like the AI battle or race, so to speak. And so that was a super interesting one as well. And then another one on like negotiation that I thought was like really impactful, and I've used so many of these tactics, obviously much lower stake situations, with this FBI hostage negotiator, Chris Voss. He wrote Never Split the Difference, and so that was like a really interesting one as well. One on networking is like Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi, and that was a really good one too. I think it was like the CMO of Deloitte. Has a really interesting perspective around his own transformation, a lot of good examples. So it was a lot, but yeah, some examples.
No, that was awesome. What's the FBI negotiator one?
It's called Never Split the Difference. It's by Chris Voss.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I want to check that out. You have some
Yeah,
really, really interesting reads there.
yeah.
So this is a fun one. Took this from Tim Ferriss. Really enjoy it. What is a purchase of like $100 or a couple $100 that has had an outsized impact of happiness or utility in your life?
Yeah, I think it's sort of my like computer monitor, like the larger screen. Like I had always seen people like use it, but I was always like, what does that really do? Like you just look weird on the computer where you're looking away from the screen, but it's like actually huge. Like I feel I haven't measured this, but I feel like I'm just like so much more productive with it. And so that's been like really, really huge for me. And I think the other thing is just like actually just like kind of being able to, I'm like very stingy with my money. So I don't really spend that much, but I think even like letting myself like spend, like a few dozen like here and there on just like little things like, oh, like I want to try this like new cereal or like this new there's all these kind of like new D2C products. And so kind of like just giving myself like a little bit of space to kind of try different things is like really, really interesting, really helpful.
Yeah, you gotta splurge a little bit. But I do
Exactly.
I do like the monitor thing. I know the joke in finance is the more monitors, the better until you get like 20 and you're sitting at the desk and you're surrounded by screens. But I've been on single screen for a while, and I definitely miss having it's just so nice to like have one dock on the side
Yeah,
that you leave open that you can reference to. Like that's huge.
exactly.
Um, I definitely want you to promote yourself. So, where are all the places that are best to find you online?
Yeah, so feel free to DM me on Twitter. I'm just Jessica, my middle name, Feya, Feiya, and my last name Lee. Actually, funny story, like my actual name, like without the middle name, is so common that like in college, there's another girl who was like she was like in college for a couple of years, like not in this exact same time, like not all 4 years, but like we would literally try to both like create accounts with like the psych department or like anything, and then they would shut one of our accounts down. They're like, you have two accounts. I'm like, no, we're like actually not the same people. They're like, no, like you are. And then they just like shut like one of our accounts down. Actually, she had a little brother with the same name as my little brother. So it's very odd. But basically my middle name is very uncommon. So I've just been using that for my email and everything. So that, and then also on LinkedIn, just my normal name, Jessica Lee. And then also I have a site. It's like a very low touch, like Notion site. It's just bit.ly and then my name without the middle name. And so that's sort of where some of my work lives.
That's really funny. I haven't bumped into another Matt Snow yet, but
Yeah,
there
me
are some
neither.
out there. I've looked them up. They do exist. The domain mattsnow.com was taken, unfortunately.
Mm.
Might have to talk to that one. But
Yes.
yeah, no. Well, that's funny. It explains now. I guess I never wondered, like, oh, why is the middle name always in the initial?
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like there's like nobody else in the world, with my middle name or like very off the grid or like with my, all three. Because I like have it on Twitter, like on email, on Instagram, like everywhere. And so I guess like, whoever has the same name, all three, is like very off the grid or like they just don't exist. So that's sort of been a fun find.
Well, one day when you have your first $500 million fund, you should do Faya Ventures and go buy like
Exactly. Yes, that will definitely not be taken.
um, well, as always, Jess, it's been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to the next time we're able to chat.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jess.
Looking to innovate, invent, and disrupt? We're your partner to fuel your growth. Contact us to learn more.